For feet beneath her own living room, buried under layers of packed earth and reinforced timber, lay the secret that would save her life, and the same secret her neighbors had spent weeks laughing at. When Margaret Ellis first took a sledgehammer to the wooden floor of her modest Wyoming home, the sharp cracks echoed across the frozen valley, drawing curious glances and quiet ridicule from everyone within a mile radius. By the second day, when the floorboards were gone and a dark, uneven pit began to take shape where her living room once stood, curiosity turned into open mockery. "She's finally lost it," muttered Earl Dawson at the gas station, shaking his head as he poured coffee into a chipped thermos, digging herself a grave right inside her own house. Others laughed harder when delivery trucks started arriving. Loads of gravel, rigid foam insulation, thick plastic vapor barriers, and stacks of pressure-treated lumber. Margaret, a wiry woman in her early 60s with sun-weathered skin and steady, deliberate movements, didn't argue, didn't explain, and certainly didn't stop. She simply worked. From sunrise to well past sunset, she dug, hauled, measured, and rebuilt, lowering the entire interior of her home by nearly 4 feet, while reinforcing the surrounding structure with a precision that seemed far beyond what anyone expected from a retired school librarian. What they didn't know, what none of them cared to ask, was that Margaret had spent the previous winter studying thermal retention, soil insulation properties, and old frontier construction methods used long before central heating existed. She had read about how, just a few feet below the surface, the ground maintained a far more stable temperature than the violent swings of the air above it. She had learned that while winter winds could rip heat from walls and windows in minutes, dense earth acted like a shield, slowing heat loss to a crawl. And most importantly, she had noticed something no one else in the valley seemed willing to admit. The winters were changing. The cold wasn't just colder, it was arriving faster, staying longer, and cutting deeper. She saw it in the frost lines creeping earlier across her windows each year, in the way the soil hardened weeks ahead of schedule, in the uneasy silence of mornings that used to be filled with birds but were now empty and still. While others relied on bigger heaters, more firewood, or newer technology, Margaret chose a different approach. She decided to change the house itself. By early October, the transformation was impossible to ignore. The interior floor now sat well below ground level, accessed by a short set of wooden steps descending into what looked, to outsiders, like a carefully constructed pit. The walls were lined with layered insulation and sealed tight against drafts, while the exterior foundation had been built outward and packed with compacted soil, forming a dense thermal barrier around the structure. To Margaret, it was simple physics. To her neighbors, it was absurd. "She thinks dirt is going to keep her warm?" laughed Tyler Brakes, a contractor who prided himself on modern builds and high-efficiency heating systems. "You can't just bury your house and expect it to work like magic." Others took it even less seriously. A group of teenagers drove past one afternoon, filming a short video of the partially lowered house and posting it online with captions about the underground grandma preparing for the apocalypse. The clip spread quickly through the small community, turning Margaret into an unwilling joke. But she never responded. Not when people slowed their trucks to stare. Not when they whispered. Not even when someone shouted, "Hope you like living in a hole," as they passed her driveway. Instead, she kept refining her work. She sealed gaps others wouldn't even notice, tested airflow, reinforced load-bearing beams, and carefully monitored how the interior temperature responded to changes in the weather. By the time the first frost settled in late October, Margaret's home was no longer just a house. It was something else entirely. Something designed, not for comfort in good weather, but for survival in bad. Meanwhile, life around her continued as usual. Her closest neighbors, the Harpers, had recently installed a brand new electric heating system connected to a backup generator. Across the road, the Millers relied on a massive wood stove and had already stacked enough firewood to last what they assumed would be the harshest winter in years. Further down the valley, newer homes with large windows and open layouts stood as symbols of modern living, efficient, stylish, and, as their owners believed, more than capable of handling whatever nature had in store. Margaret watched it all quietly, saying nothing, even as her instincts told her a different story. Because while others trusted systems, supplies, and assumptions, she trusted patterns. She trusted the subtle warnings most people ignored, The strange stillness in the air, the early migration of animals, the way the wind had begun to shift direction weeks earlier than usual. These were not coincidences to her. They were signals, and they all pointed to one conclusion. This winter wasn't going to be normal. By mid-November, the ground had already begun to harden, locking in the changes she had made to her home. Snow fell earlier than expected, light at first, then heavier, coating the valley in a thick, silent blanket. Temperatures dipped steadily, and while most residents simply turned up their heat or added another log to the fire, Margaret conducted quiet observations inside her lowered living space. Even without running her small stove, the temperature remained noticeably more stable than before. The difference wasn't dramatic yet, but it was there, and it was enough to confirm what she had believed from the beginning. Still, the laughter didn't stop. If anything, it grew louder as winter approached. "Let's see how that dirt works when it hits -20. Someone joked at the local store. "She'll be begging for firewood like the rest of us." Margaret simply paid for her supplies, nodded politely, and left. Because she wasn't preparing for -20. She was preparing for something far worse. And when the wind finally shifted for good, when the sky darkened in a way that felt unnatural, and when the temperature began to fall faster than anyone had predicted, the people who laughed the loudest would be the first to realize just how wrong they had been. The storm didn't arrive like the others. It announced itself with a sudden, unnatural silence that settled over the Wyoming Valley by late afternoon, as if the entire landscape had paused to brace for something far worse than winter. Margaret Ellis noticed it immediately. The wind, which usually whispered through the trees before a snowfall, had completely vanished. Even the usual creaks of shifting wood and distant animal sounds were gone. Then, just after dusk, the temperature began to drop. Not gradually, but violently, as if someone had opened a door to another world. Within hours, it plunged past anything the locals had seen in decades. By 8 p.m., the power grid failed across the county, lines snapping under the weight of ice and relentless pressure from the cold. Houses that had glowed warmly against the snow went dark one by one, swallowed by the storm. Inside those homes, panic didn't come immediately. It crept in slowly, disguised as confidence. People lit fireplaces, turned on generators, and trusted the systems they had always relied on. But the storm was different this time. The wind didn't just blow. It tore through the valley with a force that made walls tremble and windows groan under pressure. Temperatures dropped past -30, then pushed lower, the kind of cold that didn't just chill a room but invaded it, seeping through every crack, every seam, every material not designed to withstand it. In the Harper household, their brand new electric heating system became useless the moment the power died, and their backup generator, exposed just enough to the elements, froze solid before it could fully engage. Within hours, their home, once comfortably warm, began losing heat faster than they could replace it. Across the road, the Millers fed log after log into their massive wood stove, but the cold outside consumed that heat like a bottomless void. By midnight, frost had begun forming along their interior walls, creeping outward like veins of ice. In newer homes down the valley, the situation was even worse. Large windows, once prized for their scenic views, became massive points of heat loss, radiating cold into living spaces until the air itself felt sharp to breathe. Pipes started freezing, then bursting, leaving behind silent damage that would only be discovered later. Meanwhile, inside Margaret's home, something entirely different was happening. The storm raged above her, wind screaming across the land, but 4 feet below ground, her living space remained shielded from the worst of it. The packed earth surrounding her home acted exactly as she had predicted. It absorbed and slowed the cold, preventing it from directly attacking her walls. The temperature inside didn't stay warm in the traditional sense, but it stayed stable. Where others watched their indoor heat vanish in a matter of hours, Margaret's home lost warmth so slowly it was almost unnoticeable. She sat at her small table, a single lantern casting soft light across the lowered room, listening to the muffled roar of the storm above. There were no violent drafts, no rattling windows, no desperate need to constantly feed a fire. Even her small stove, which she lit briefly for cooking, was enough to maintain a livable environment. It wasn't comfort, it was control. But outside, that control was collapsing for everyone else. By 1 a.m., The Harper family had retreated into a single room, wrapped in blankets, their breath visible in the air as their home continued to lose heat. The Millers, despite burning through their wood supply at an alarming rate, could no longer keep up with the cold, their once powerful stove now barely holding back the freezing air. And in the newer homes, the situation turned dangerous. Without power, without sufficient insulation, and with designs that prioritized aesthetics over resilience, the cold invaded completely. It was no longer about staying warm, it was about surviving the night. Then came the moment no one expected. A sharp, desperate pounding broke through the storm, not loud, but frantic, urgent, the kind of sound that only comes when someone has run out of options. Margaret heard it clearly, even through the thick insulation and layers of earth. She stood immediately, already knowing what it meant. When she opened her reinforced door, the wind didn't blast inside the way it did in other homes. It was dulled, weakened by the structure she had built. On her doorstep stood two of her neighbors, barely able to remain upright, their faces pale, their movements slow and uncoordinated from the cold. Their heavy coats were stiff with ice, their gloves soaked through, and their eyes carried the unmistakable look of fear that comes when survival is no longer certain. We couldn't keep it warm," one of them managed to say, his voice trembling uncontrollably. Margaret didn't ask questions. She didn't hesitate. She simply stepped aside, allowing them to enter. The moment they crossed into her home, the difference hit them, not as warmth, but as relief. The air wasn't attacking them anymore. Their bodies, pushed to the edge by the brutal cold, finally had a chance to recover. They collapsed onto chairs, hands shaking, trying to process what they were feeling. "How is this possible?" the other whispered, looking around at the lowered walls, the compact space, the quiet stillness that felt completely disconnected from the chaos outside. Margaret moved calmly, handing them blankets, heating water, giving simple instructions to help them stabilize. She didn't explain, not yet, because even as they sat there, stunned by what they were experiencing, the storm outside was still growing stronger. And the truth was, they weren't the last ones who would come knocking that night. By the time the second round of knocking came, it wasn't hesitant, it was frantic, desperate, and relentless, the kind of pounding that echoed with pure fear rather than uncertainty. Margaret Ellis was already awake, sitting quietly near her small stove, listening to the storm press against the earth above her like a living force trying to claw its way in. She didn't rush, but she didn't delay either. When she opened the door, 3 more figures stumbled inside almost at once, collapsing onto the lowered floor, their bodies shaking uncontrollably, their faces pale and drawn from hours of exposure. One of them, Tyler Brace, the same contractor who had openly mocked her just weeks earlier, could barely speak, his lips cracked and trembling as he tried to form words. It's gone," he managed to choke out. Everything gone." Margaret closed the door behind them, sealing out what little remained of the outside world, and for a moment, no one spoke. The contrast was too overwhelming. Outside, the storm screamed with a violence that tore through homes and shredded every assumption people had made about their safety. Inside, just 4 feet below the surface, there was only stillness. Not warmth in the way they were used to, but something far more important: stability, control, survival. She moved with the same calm precision she had shown for months, handing out blankets, guiding them to sit, instructing them to remove wet outer layers before the cold could do more damage. No one argued. No one questioned. The same people who had laughed at her, filmed her, dismissed her as paranoid, now followed every word without hesitation, because the truth was undeniable. They were alive because of the very thing they had ridiculed. Hours passed slowly, measured not by clocks, but by the gradual return of feeling to frozen fingers and the steady calming of frantic breaths. The small, lowered home filled with quiet murmurs as people began to process what had happened. Not just the storm, but their complete unpreparedness for it. Tyler sat hunched near the wall, staring at the floor beneath him as if seeing it for the first time. "You knew," he said eventually, his voice low, almost ashamed. "You saw this coming." Margaret didn't look at him. She simply adjusted the flame on her stove. "I saw enough," she replied. "Enough to know the cold doesn't care what we think is enough." No one had a response to that, because deep down, they all understood it now. The systems they trusted had failed. The designs they believed in had collapsed under pressure. But this simple, almost primitive idea of working with the earth instead of against it had held strong. By morning, the storm had not weakened. If anything, it had intensified, burying homes, roads, and vehicles beneath layers of wind-packed snow. Communication lines were down. Rescue was nowhere in sight. The small group inside Margaret's home realized something important in that moment. They weren't just waiting out the storm anymore. They were depending on her to survive it. And Margaret, despite everything, carried no resentment. She shared what she had, rationed carefully, and kept the environment as stable as possible. She explained little things when asked, how the ground insulated them, how the lowered structure reduced exposure, how minimizing air exchange kept heat from escaping. But she never spoke with pride or vindication. There was no "I told you so." Only quiet, practical knowledge passed along when it mattered. Over the next 2 days, the storm slowly began to lose its grip. The wind weakened first, then the snowfall eased, and eventually, a heavy silence replaced the chaos. When the clouds finally broke and pale sunlight touched the valley again, what it revealed was devastation. Homes stood frozen and damaged, some partially collapsed under the weight of snow, others hollowed out by the cold that had invaded them. Pipes were shattered, windows cracked, entire interiors turned into ice-filled shells. But Margaret's home stood unchanged. The ground around it had shielded it, preserved it, protected it in a way no modern system had managed to do. When emergency crews finally reached the area days later, they were met with a scene that made little sense at first glance. Multiple homes in critical condition, and one small, partially buried structure functioning almost perfectly. Inside it, a group of neighbors who had once mocked its owner now worked side by side, clearing space, reinforcing weak points, and helping Margaret maintain the very system that had saved them. Tyler was among them, his movements slower than usual, his hands still recovering, but his attitude completely transformed. At one point, he paused, looking around the lowered room with a quiet disbelief that hadn't left him since the night of the storm. "All this time," he said, almost to himself, "we thought you were digging your way into the ground." Margaret glanced at him briefly, then back at her work. "No," she said simply. "I was digging my way out of the cold." And that was the moment everything truly changed, not just for the people in that room, but for the entire community. Because when the next winter came, and the one after that, the valley didn't look the same anymore. Homes were built differently. Foundations ran deeper. Insulation improved. People paid attention, not just to forecasts, but to the land itself. And the story of the woman who dug her floor 4 feet into the ground stopped being a joke. It became a lesson, one that no one there would ever forget.